Hey, what's going on everyone? Greg here, and one big concern a lot of Mac buyers had last year was when purchasing one of these higher end configurations of, say, an M1 Pro or even an M1 Max Mac was, were these going to quickly become obsolete when the inevitable M2 Max came out? And well, today we actually have our first M2 Mac, the M2 MacBook Pro. Now, this M2 Mac obviously doesn't have the higher end configurations yet. We would obviously expect like an M2 Pro to beat out an M1 Pro, right? It's the next generation chip. We all know that. But there was probably some concern among some people of, would an M2 chip be able to beat out something like an M1 Pro or even an M1 Max when it had higher single-threaded performance? Well, we're gonna try and find that out in today's video on comparing the cheapest MacBook Pro, this new M2 MacBook Pro, which retails for $1,299.
$599 US.
And we're going to pit it up against this 14-inch M1 Max MacBook Pro at the highest end configuration. So it has the full M1 Max CPU, which is a 10-core CPU, and it even has a 32-core GPU complete with 64 gigabytes of memory. And this configuration with 1 terabyte of storage would cost you $3,699, or I actually have an even higher end configuration of that with 4 terabytes of storage with the fastest SSD in a MacBook Pro, and that runs for $4,699. So this is gonna be an interesting comparison. The cheapest M2 Mac against the most expensive 14-inch M1 Max MacBook Pro. Now, like all good benchmarking tests, I think we gotta start it off with doing the most basic benchmark of all. Let's run these two through a Geekbench benchmark. And as we run Geekbench on both of these machines, you can see that one of the things about the M2 chip is that it does have the faster single core performance. It's actually a pretty nice increase. So we got 1,939 single core score on the M2 compared to the 1,784 single core score on the M1 Max chip. However, even with the faster cores on this M2 chip, it is still no match for the brute force of the 8 performance cores found on this M1 Max chip, and that will give us a multi-core score of 12,508, beating out the M2's chip's 8,989 score. And no surprise, when we run our Cinebench benchmark, we can also see pretty much the same thing. So the M1 Max chip is gonna beat out the M2 chip with a 12,336 score compared to the 8,862 score found on the M2 chip, which are pretty similar scores to what we see in Geekbench. Obviously, no surprises there. Now, one thing I was very interested to know with this new M2 chip, considering it had higher single-threaded performance, well, it should have some everyday kind of advantages when you compare it against the M1 Max chip. And what I mean by that is very simple tasks like opening an app, for example, should be faster on this M2 Mac. And just doing quick little side-by-side tests, running both of these machines and like opening an app at the same time, I found that turned out to be true. It wasn't like a huge difference, but the M2 opened apps slightly faster than this more expensive M1 Max MacBook Pro. So if you're a basic user and you're not using this thing for professional tasks like video editing, photo editing, anything that would require higher end multi-threaded performance, this will actually be faster for you, this M2 MacBook Pro, and that is actually very interesting. Now this is just CPU performance, so what about GPU performance? The M2 makes a pretty big leap in GPU technology. It is 35% faster than the previous M1 chip, and it even gets 2 additional GPU cores unlike the CPU cores. So this has a 10-core GPU on the M2 MacBook Pro, but the M1 Max MacBook Pro has a 32-core GPU. So I think we know which one's gonna win here, but let's go ahead and run a couple benchmarks anyway. So running GFX Bench with the Aztec Ruins high-tier off-screen 4K test, we can see that the M2 scores 3,128 frames with an overall 48 frames per second. And then the M1 Max scores 7,993 frames with an overall 124 frames per second. Next, I loaded up Shadow of the Tomb Raider to actually see what we can expect for gaming performance out of these two machines. I put it on the highest settings at 1080p resolution, and we can see that the M1 Max chip is obviously scoring a higher frame rate overall here as we run through this benchmark. But I was kind of surprised to see that the M2 MacBook Pro was hovering very close to 30 frames per second on the highest settings. I know this isn't like a gaming laptop or anything, but for its pretty sleek profile, I thought that was actually pretty good. If you change the resolution around, this could totally be playable on the highest settings on the 13-inch M2 MacBook Pro. But still, it's no match for the M1 Max chip, because as we finish off this benchmark test, the M1 Max scored an average of 70 frames per second, and the M2 MacBook Pro sadly scored just below an average of 30 frames per second, 29 FPS overall. All right, like we usually do with most of our benchmark videos, let's finish this off with a combination of a lot of these different CPU and GPU tasks, and let's turn it over to Final Cut Pro, where we can do a video export test. So for the first test, we're going to be exporting the same 10-minute 4K clip. It's a very simple clip, no color grading, no LUTs, no 3D effects, but we're just gonna export that into H.264 and then into ProRes. And as we run through this export on H.264, you can see that the 14-inch M1 Max MacBook Pro is coming out way ahead of the M2 machine. The H.264 file on the 14-inch MacBook Pro exports in 2 minutes and 45 seconds, while it takes the M2 machine about double the amount of time to export that video file, finishing out at 5 minutes and 4 seconds. Running that same export, but this time exporting it to ProRes, wields some pretty amazing results on the 14-inch M1 Max MacBook Pro. It exports that file in just 1 minute and 13 seconds. I love the ProRes export times on the 14-inch model. It is really impressive. And the M2 MacBook Pro takes almost 3 times as long to do this same ProRes export. It's gonna finish out that export in 3 minutes and 8 seconds. Okay, so performance-wise, what have we learned? Well, I think we've learned that for basic tasks with that higher single core performance, if you're not doing performative tasks like video editing, or you're not doing any sort of gaming, well, the M2 MacBook Pro might actually be the better choice in terms of performance, because you can open up apps faster, maybe they'll be a little bit more responsive. But if you're doing any sort of pro work, I mean, we are battling the pro laptops here. People buying this are probably gonna be doing something professional, whether that's video editing, photo editing, development, 3D rendering, something that would require that higher multi-threaded performance or that higher GPU performance. Well, obviously, the higher end, the redesigned M1 Pro and M1 Max MacBook Pros are probably going to give you better performance in those areas. And another thing we should really talk about with these machines is they're not equal in other areas. So obviously the 14-inch MacBook Pro gets a totally new redesign, has a new squared off body, has more ports with an HDMI port, an SD card slot, and 3 Thunderbolt ports, as well as a dedicated MagSafe charger, where the 13-inch M2 MacBook Pro just has 2 Thunderbolt ports and then a headphone jack. The screen on the 14-inch MacBook Pro is also a lot better. Not only is it bigger, obviously having a 14-inch display compared to a 13.3-inch display, but it also is a mini LED display, so it gets significantly brighter for HDR video, gets up to 1600 nits of peak brightness, and it also has local dimming zones, so it gets really good black levels. It could support up to 1,000,000:1 contrast ratio, and if you compare these side by side, the 13-inch MacBook Pro can just look a little bit washed out in comparison, especially with really dark scenes. Speakers on the 14-inch are also really good, room-filling sound, where on the 13-inch it's really starting to show its age with this older design and definitely gets a little bit more distorted at higher volumes and definitely is not as full and as room-filling as the 14-inch model. And that display also is more bezel-less. The 14-inch has a notch design, which some people really hate, so that could be a pro or a con for you. It's a pro for me. I like this design a lot better than the 13-inch offers. And the webcam. So the 14-inch MacBook Pro is a 1080p webcam, and this 13-inch M2 MacBook Pro still just has a 720p webcam, so obviously a big advantage to the 14-inch model here. And another oddity between these two laptops is the 14-inch has a function key row, just regular function key row with physical keys. The 13-inch still has a touch bar. So again, I don't know if that's a pro or a con for you. For me, I just feel like the writing is on the wall. The touch bar is gonna be gone, but if you're really a big touch bar fan, this might be the last model where you can get it. And then, I think we've been pretty mean to this M2 MacBook Pro in this design area, but let's give it some pros, right? Let's give it some actual accolades here. This is lighter than the 14-inch model. This weighs just 3 pounds, very close to the weight of the M1 MacBook Air, which is 2.8 pounds, even close to the weight of the new M2 MacBook Air, which is 2.7 pounds. So still a very light laptop. And if you compare that to the 14-inch MacBook Pro, this is gonna be 3.5 pounds, so heavier to bring this around. And this 13-inch model is also thinner than the 14-inch model. So if you put them side by side, you can see that the 14-inch model is indeed thicker. So if you are looking for a more portable laptop, it's not gonna win the award by much. But yeah, this 13-inch model is certainly thinner and certainly lighter. So it does deserve credit for that as well. And another big benefit to this model, I will say, is the battery life should be longer on it. This has a 20-hour rating, where the 14-inch has a 17-hour rating, and then we're comparing the most expensive against the base model, right? So with the M1 Max chip, that sucks up even more energy on this 14-inch model, and you're definitely gonna get less battery life if you're using more power-hungry applications, whereas on the 13-inch M2 MacBook Pro, the battery is gonna last you significantly longer. So if you need more battery life, I guess that's another win for this one. But listen, the point of this video was kind of to see if the M2 chip would obsolete the M1 Pro or even the M1 Max chip when it came out, and that's just not the case, right? It's a little bit confusing because we now have a new numbered chip generation, and if you're a consumer walking in to buy a MacBook Pro, you might be confused thinking, M2, the number's higher, that means it's better. And that's just not the case. The M1 machines still have their use if you're getting one of those higher spec M1 Pro or M1 Max, or hey, even an M1 Ultra machine with the Mac Studio. So they are still way above in performance with multi-threaded performance and especially with GPU performance. So yeah, still these 14-inch and 16-inch MacBook Pros, probably the best laptops that I have ever used overall. I just really love this laptop. I should probably do an updated review on it one day because I love it so much. But still, obviously, even in the age of M2 now being out, these are still worth it. These are really great laptops. And honestly, if you start to spec out this 13-inch model and start adding in storage, adding in memory, it gets very close to the price of the base model M1 Pro MacBook Pro. And if you're getting near that pricing territory on this M2 model, I would say if you're using it for any sort of professional work, just go with the 14-inch MacBook Pro. I think it's a much better product overall. All right, but that was a comparison between the cheapest 13-inch M2 MacBook Pro and the most expensive M1 Max MacBook Pro. Why did we do this? I don't know, it was fun. But hopefully you found the information useful. If you did, make sure to give me a like. If you want to see more from the channel, make sure you're subscribed. And as always, thank you so much for watching, and hopefully I'll see you in the next video. Take care, everyone.